So I've read the Brexit agreement, so you don't have to. 4 things in the Brexit agreement which stand out for me from an Irish perspective. The first one is that the EU has insisted on protecting Ireland from the very start, all the way through the agreement. I think it emphasises the importance of membership of the EU, and it actually illustrates the benefits of being a member of the EU. I think in the Brexit debate, the Eurosceptics always emphasise the cost of the EU and never the benefits. I think we are seeing the benefits of being an EU member here, where the EU stood firmly behind Ireland. In the future relationship document, there's 7 articles which protect Ireland. Article 13, Peace Plus, reconciliation in the 6 counties, further commitment to that. Article 19, a commitment to the backstop, very controversial for Eurosceptics. Article 27, technology to ensure no hard border after the transition period, placates the Eurosceptics to an extent in that they always said we can avoid a hard border due to technology. It's been kicked to touch, but it's there. Article 45, CTA, common travel area between the UK and Ireland. There will always be free movement of people between Ireland and the UK. That's essentially because the UK still look on Ireland as a colony. Article 139, protecting the Good Friday Agreement in all of its parts. It's very insistent on that. Every aspect of the Good Friday Agreement is protected under this agreement, because that's what's keeping the fabric of peace here together. For serious conflict in Ireland from about 1969 to 1994, 25 years of violence between 2 communities, the 6 counties of the northeast of Ireland. In 1994, the Good Friday Agreement put an end to that, and it has stayed very peaceful ever since. Fantastic model for peace, which should be used all over the world. There's scope to use it in the Middle East. There's going to be a peace conference in Ireland in January. Article 142, where they're closing the agreement on the future relationship, they say there's going to be some priorities, and the only one actually explicitly mentioned is the avoidance of a hard border in Ireland. The second thing that's really emphasised here throughout this document is restricting the free movement of people. So the EU emphasises 4 freedoms: free movement of capital, people, goods and services. The one that the UK are really pushing, very obviously, is the free movement of people. It's very ironic in that they're going to keep out any people from the EU, which they probably will need throughout the document, and that seems to have been the main thing pushed by Theresa May's group.
If there's a penalisable offence after the hooter or whatever, you can kick for touch and get the...
Number 3, the point that really strikes me is really sensitive and messy stuff that they've kicked to touch. Article 70, sourcing nuclear fuel.
Huh? Noise! Bad noise!
There's been a lot of talk about sourcing medicines and clean water. Sourcing nuclear fuel, that is a messy arrangement, and that has been kicked to touch to be agreed within the next 2 years.
5 minutes before critical mass.
Critical what? Okay, don't panic. Whichever problem this is, I'm sure they know how to handle it. Huh? Ah! It's my problem! We're doomed!
Carbon pricing. The UK has to replicate the EU ETS. In the Kyoto Protocol, the polluter pays principle was introduced, and the whole notion of carbon credits and carbon pricing was introduced, so that people could buy and sell credits and that carbon would have a value. So pollution would have a penalty effectively. Incredibly complex system that the EU has developed. And for the UK to replicate that within 2 years, I think is a mammoth task. Article 75, fish. Last week, how dangerous and controversial that can be. In the Ukraine, an innocent fishery trawling incident can spark a diplomatic incident, possibly even spark a war. That one, being kicked to touch, I think is a major issue. The latest priorities that are on the minds of both the EU and the UK at the moment, and it's fascinating to see what they're particularly interested in. Article 27 says that the EU and the UK, after they break up, should focus on combating trade protectionism. There's a clear dig at Trump there. Article 78 says the EU and the UK should cooperate on the Paris Agreement. Another clear dig at Trump there, who's ripped up that agreement. Article 70, interestingly, mentions that the two should combat disinformation campaigns. Dig at Putin there. Article 111 emphasised the importance of cybersecurity. And again, it's the Russian threat, which is presumably on everybody's mind there. Article 91, which hasn't been mentioned, ending the anonymity of cryptocurrencies in order to avoid money laundering. That's an interesting one, which I haven't seen really mentioned before, but it's obviously on people's minds. 92 will be an interesting one for the conspiracy theorists, implementing a rules-based international order. Article 99 emphasises maintaining the importance of sanctions as a foreign policy tool. Again, Putin is on their mind there. Article 106 is an interesting one in that it talks about the importance of gathering space-based intelligence imagery. Fascinating. I think one of the bullets that the UK has dodged on Brexit is the EU copyright law, which is peripherally mentioned in the document. Very controversial and seen as being very regressive on freedom to share information on the internet. From an Irish perspective, Brexit has been fascinating in that many issues which had been buried for many, many years, and the British would have rather been buried for many years, have now resurfaced. For instance, the prospect of a united Ireland has resurfaced. In 1922, the country was partitioned under a treaty between Ireland and the UK. The 6 northeastern counties of Ireland were to stay in the United Kingdom. 26 counties were to form a free state. When Michael Collins signed the treaty back in 1922, he was promised a boundary commission which would review these 6 counties and whether some of them might rejoin the free state. That never happened, never materialised. And really, there's been very little discussion of the border for the last 100 years, until now. And the border has been in the news non-stop ever since Brexit has come, because it has been the main sticking point, because it ceased to be just a border between 26 counties of Ireland and 6 counties in the northeast. It ceased to be just that. It was going to become a border of the European Union itself. For the very first time, the European Union and the international community came on board. That has accelerated the prospect of united Ireland. I think it's almost inevitable at this stage, which is very ironic in that the Little Englanders and the Unionists have pushed Brexit, probably will result in a united Ireland inadvertently. The DUP find themselves in a fascinating, ironic situation and very offended. How dare people make an exception of Northern Ireland and give it special treatment by allowing it privilege of being in the common market as well as being in the internal market of the UK. The DUP have actually snookered themselves as well in that they always could claim, and rightfully, that they represented the majority of people in the 6 counties, because the slight majority are unionists, about 60% at this stage, a majority which has been decreasing as the years go by. However, now they've, by backing Brexit, undone that, because the majority of people in the 6 counties want to remain in the EU and voted accordingly. So now the Unionists no longer represent the majority of people in the 6 counties, which has also accelerated the process towards United Ireland. Some politicians have a reputation which is based on a legacy and probably doesn't really bear much truth in reality. For instance, in Ireland, Sinn Féin are considered the Republican Party, whereas Fine Gael and Leo Varadkar are considered sometimes by others unfairly, I think, as the opposite. But our current Taoiseach, in reality, Leo Varadkar of Fine Gael, I think has probably done more to advance the cause of united Ireland than Sinn Féin have done in 30 years, simply by being very strong in the negotiating stance on the 6 counties, ensuring no hard border, and being very close to the EU and ensuring that the EU was very close with us and backed us all the way throughout this agreement. The UK was never fully in the EU in the first place. It always had this messy rebate which it demanded, and it was the only country that had it, and also it stayed out of the euro. It's fascinating that if or when the UK does rejoin, and I think that's inevitable, will they get that rebate back? Unlikely. And I would imagine that if it does apply for membership ever again, that membership of the euro will be mandatory this time, which in some ways might make it impossible for it to rejoin if the Eurosceptics put their foot down. When Eurosceptics talk about the burden of EU regulation, effectively what they're talking about is all of those pointless things that the EU tries to protect, like clean air, clean water, those messy things that really get in the way of business just getting on with their profit-making activities. Of course, the ironic thing is that the UK Parliament has adopted every EU piece of legislation into its domestic legislation so that there will be absolutely no change when it leaves. Other aspects of the future relationship deal are quite interesting. Article 7 asserts agreement of both parties to the European Convention on Human Rights, which is interesting because it was some Tory backbenchers did want to scrap the ECHR, and that was one of the reasons for exiting the EU, but it's in here as a commitment. Article 8, data protection. No, I'm quite in favour of the EU, but one of the aspects which I find quite despairing is the data protection regulations, especially GDPR, which I think has been an unmitigated disaster. It started with possibly noble reasons in order to protect people's sensitive data, such as medical records, now resulted in an utterly farcical situation where people have to send you a begging email to be notified about the local bake sale. I think people are getting way too prima donna about personal data and what personal data even means now. And I think the EU is behind that. Article 11 is a funny one because it talks about UK participation in UN programmes after leaving. It covers absolutely everything. So it talks about youth programmes, and then later on there's mention of programmes for the elderly, keeping everybody in the tent apart from the middle-aged. Who's in that bracket? Science, innovation, youth, culture, education, overseas development, external action, defence, civil protection, and interestingly, space. Now, one fascinating footnote to that is that it says that these should include fair and appropriate financial contribution. It's interesting that not only is the 40 billion for settlement, but also there are additional items here which are going to be part of the bill. Article 17 is the hub really, where it says respect for the integrity of the single market, which has been the sticking point from the EU side. The EU have insisted on not budging the integrity of the single market, which has caused difficulties over the backstop in the 6 counties. There is also the provision for the integrity of the UK internal market, and it does provide for development of an independent trade policy to be developed beyond this agreement, which is of course important to the Brexiteers. Essentially, without that, there is no Brexit. There is a lot of very nerdy technical detail in terms of customs, fascinating terms. Article 24 talks about customs sanitary and phytosanitary measures, SPS, health of plants in trade. So now you know. Article 25 is a fairly controversial one. It talks about the UK will consider aligning with EU rules in relevant areas. I can just imagine Jacob Rees-Mogg screaming in the bed at that one. Real heavy push from the UK side on the negotiating side is completely transparent and obvious. It's about restricting the movement of people. Article 32 talks about allowing temporary entry of natural persons for business reasons. And natural persons is a fascinating term. What they mean there is humans. Persons can mean an actual company being transferred from the EU to the UK. Natural person is a human being. Article 52, again emphasising the reduction of free movement, free travel for short-term visits. It has visas written all over it, which sounds like a real regressive step. Aviation. It says that the agreement should ensure a comprehensive air travel agreement, a CATA. It doesn't exist yet, and that would be a massive undertaking. This is something Michael O'Leary from Ryanair has been very strong about. Michael O'Leary claims that after March 29th, aircraft aren't going to be able to land in the UK. He thinks it's that severe.
If the UK leaves the European Union, it must leave open skies. And therefore, as things currently stand, there is no flight rights between the UK and Europe and vice versa.
Article 63 then talks about rail transport. And again, the 6 counties of Northern Ireland are mentioned. So it ensures the protection of the Dublin to Belfast enterprise line. Single train line has been singled out in an international agreement for protection. There are then talks of where the EU and the UK should cooperate at global fora such as the G7 and the G20. Thematic cooperation, mutually important to both, about aligning legal arrangements between the EU and the UK. When there's legal text, there has to be the mandatory Latin phrase. So here we have the transnational ne bis in idem principle, providing against double jeopardy, charged in law for the same offence twice. Article 86 is interesting. It talks about data exchange, about passenger name records. A lot of people would see this as Big Brother stuff, but it's quite necessary, and particularly to protect against global terrorism. But it also talks about DNA and fingerprinting, containing biometric information. Article 147 talks about their future relationship, and it does commit to a high-level conference every 6 months between the two parties, between the UK and the EU. So that ensures that they really don't drift apart, that there's going to be some level of cooperation and meetings between the two parties.